Thank you for the invitation to address CEDA on the political outlook for the year. I concede when I accepted this invitation late last year, I didn't quite expect the extraordinary events of the last several weeks. I should have obviously borne Michael's buzzword of uncertainty into my own outlook. The consolation for Scott Morrison, I think, is that the political outlook for the year looked even worse in February 2019 than it does in February 20. He didn't lose his confidence or conviction then, and I don't think he will now, but he was badly rattled by the public reaction to his Hawaii trip and his handling of the bushfire crisis, clearly. So given early 2020 hasn't gone at all according to plan, even before the coronavirus struck, it's far from certain the Prime Minister can regain the necessary political momentum and personal authority he lost over a torrid summer that he didn't see coming. First to the immediate politics, we're obviously all more sceptical of polls these days, not least the media, but I think it's pretty true to say that most committed Liberal voters haven't given up on Morrison and are still just willing to excuse his past mistakes, assuming he learns from them. Of course, those who disliked him last year now dislike him far more passionately. As usual, it's the reaction of those voters who aren't committed but who did back the coalition government and Morrison personally, directly or via preferences at the last election, who are making the government far more nervous. I was in Canberra for the return of Parliament last week, and the mood of hubris evident at the end of last year is certainly shaken. Not, however, the sense of aggravation that Morrison gets an unfair deal from the media, including now the condemnation by the international media in the wake of the bushfires, and from much of the public debate. But there is a belated acceptance that a series of misjudgments means the government needs to reset. Morrison has been unusually in apology mode, even willing to say an occasional sorry, as the Labor Party tries to define him as arrogant. None of this will be straightforward for the coalition, as the continuing ructions over personalities and policy in the National Party have demonstrated yet again, and will continue to do. Despite the claims of a return to stability last week, now laughable, Michael McCormack will not be National Leader and Deputy PM by the time of the next election, and presumably much sooner than that, with all of the disruptions and arguments and internal party criticisms being part of the story in the meantime. Witness the embarrassment of the vote on Monday for what should have been a non-story, the failure of McCormack's pick as Deputy Speaker in favour of Lou O'Brien, a man few people had ever heard of prior to his resignation from the Nationals. The more that sort of division happens, the weaker a Prime Minister obviously looks in his ability to manage his government, let alone the country, as everyone likes to say. Queensland, it turns out, doesn't just spell trouble for Labor leaders. Control of the numbers in Parliament is more volatile, and the appeals for coalition unity will fall on deaf ears until this ugly brawl plays out, and it will continue indefinitely. Who ever cared about Collinsville outside central Queensland until the prospect of a coal-fired power generation suddenly erupted this week? But whatever happens, the junior partner will be inevitably headed in a direction of being more Barnaby-like aggressive, including giving Morrison much more public trouble on issues like climate change policy and support for coal. These arguments have been drowning out the government's attempts to reset and to get back to business and promote achievements like, the visit of the free trade deal with Indonesia. Despite, however, the instant exaggerated enthusiasm of his many opponents in January that he couldn't last, Morrison will go to the next election as PM. How successfully he does so will depend on how much he can assert control over the policy and political agenda from now on. And in that sense, the sports rorts affair, remember that, we go so fast from chaos to chaos here, and the latest arguments over the so-called, I love this, female facilities and water safety stream funding are peripheral issues. But they also reflect an image that Morrison was previously good at challenging, that one of corrupted politics and politicians on the make. In other words, the business of politics as usual. So he needs to differentiate himself from that image, and he's obviously, I think, having trouble at the moment. The decline in trust in all institutions, including politicians, is certainly not just an Australian phenomenon, but it's certainly proving very volatile territory for this government. During the election, Morrison famously said he'd be campaigning and governing for people who don't like paying attention to politics in their daily lives, and that worked a treat. But playing daggy dad, going to the footy and sounding like an ordinary family man won't be near enough by the end of 2020 or even mid-2020, particularly if people are now more sceptical of his ability to lead and to reassure. He needs to be in the business of being seen to deliver real results, at least to those who voted for him. Morrison's ability to do that for his base, a la Trump, is hardly guaranteed. What happens to the economy is obviously key to that, with much of it, like China's economic growth and now the impact of the coronavirus, certainly beyond Canberra's control, as Morrison and Josh Frydenberg keep pointing out. Despite the stock market shrugging it off so far, we're seeing the alternative to the enormous economic boost, if not free ride, that China has given this country for well over a decade. That demonstrates how vulnerable we are, perhaps more than any other developed country, to any sudden reduction in that massive contribution. It's still too soon to be sure just how bad or extended this contraction of Chinese demand will be, just that it will go from bad to worse as the weeks go on. And that's without more other complications in the political relationship, which are obviously well documented now. They include, for example, the banning of Huawei, but they were reflective of broader grievances between the two countries, as well as the wider US-China trade war, despite the I think, a rather temporary truce at the moment for mutual interest on both sides. Both Frydenberg and the Prime Minister celebrated the RBA assessment by Philip Lowe last week that the economy would continue to grow at 2.75% this year and 3% next year, as evidence that Australia's economic fundamentals remain very strong. That was in public. In private, they were far more surprised by his relative optimism. They remain frustrated by Lowe's continuing very public calls for greater fiscal stimulus, and this is actually highly unusual for an RBA governor, and of course they can't do a thing about it. And I think, of course, that call was repeated by Michael Blyth. So it just shows, I think, there's a kind of difference between the general economic view and what the government is planning on. But the combination of the impact of the coronavirus and on the back of the drought, followed by bushfires, is just the latest challenge for an economy that's been struggling to get traction domestically. The government does boast of the economy's resilience, its strong jobs growth, its strong exports growth, and a housing market that is booming again, of course too much so in Sydney and Melbourne. And that's all true. Australia's exports of minerals, metals and energy commodities reached a record new high of $290 billion in 2019, up 17% on the previous record of 2018. And despite Labor's taunting, there's still a belief in the coalition that the opposition and Albanese will still struggle to attain more credibility on economic management, and that caution by the public may become even more marked if there is in fact greater economic weakness. Yet while economic management remains a traditional political strength for the coalition, another year of low wages and sluggish growth at best will obviously increase cries for the government to do more to spur growth and improve living standards. That will come from everyone, from the Reserve Bank down to the business community to the outer suburbs housing Morrison's favourite political species. The catch is that Morrison is a leader who's made a political virtue of delivering on his election campaign promises, rather than on any future change, on following tradition rather than attempting any radical new directions or innovation, of cautious incrementalism rather than dramatic reform. He won the election warning of Labor's risks and its high taxes, certainly not by selling any vision of the coalition's future agenda. He judged rightly that the Australians he was targeting were more apprehensive than welcoming of the notion of major change. So this Prime Minister was never likely to attempt major structural shifts, such as systemic trade-offs for real reform of the tax system, for example. Nor does he have much interest in pursuing reforms or changes that will create political pain with little likelihood of getting through the Senate anyway, or giving Labor an easy target for the next campaign. It's why he's sounding so cautious, for example, about any changes to the legislated increase in the super guarantee. He certainly doesn't trust business to provide wage increases as a trade-off for that. So he prefers to play it safe in tactical terms. In strategic terms, the obvious risk is looking more reactive and flat-footed in convincing Australians the government does know how to build a stronger future for them. Just by coincidence, I was at a breakfast with the Australian Financial Review this morning on Australian industry, and of course there was general expressed concern that Australia was falling behind so many other countries in this area. Yet there's little focus on innovation, despite, obviously there's some, successes in government, I think, and certainly in their rhetoric, and not nearly as much as there should be from much of business. The promise of a surplus may be popular with voters and a lot of business, but it was never going to be sufficient of itself as the goal. And now it can no longer be held up as the government's holy grail anyway, given the uncertainty of the risks facing the economy, both global and domestic. So the new budget mantra is on human cost rather than fiscal cost. Tough decisions on spending that are typical of a first past the election budget will certainly not be a priority for this government in 2020, as it instead emphasises its previous discipline. It only gives it the wherewithal now to provide the help as needed. The accelerated depreciation allowance expected in the budget, depending on how generous it is, will get some applause from business, despite complaints it should have come earlier and no doubt that it should have been bigger. It's possible, though not certain, the government will accelerate personal tax cuts. But does that mean there'll be, what it all means, however, there'll be less revenue available to meet all these raised community expectations? How much does that matter? Despite the previous session and the optimism about being positive and reaching consensus, I think the federal system is one of the worst systems in Australia for attempting such major national reforms and increasingly unwieldy. Canberra gets much of the blame for failures which are actually more the practical responsibility of the state governments. Blame shifting for school education standards and deteriorating results are a particularly pernicious perennial that seems unlikely to change when they blame the federal government rather than the states. In that sense, arguments over the adequacy of land clearing measures and preparedness of fire management for the bushfires are just the latest example of this confusion between federal and state responsibilities. But the public, more than ever in this age of media all the time, everywhere, wants the image at least of national leadership from their national government, particularly in a time of crisis. After Morrison misread this, he has been rushing to respond in a frenetic blitz of activity and appearances. Now the inevitable delays and complaints about the recovery from the destruction of the bushfires will be an obvious danger for his government, particularly given his own tarnished ability to project national leadership skills. The government will be focusing on demonstrating compassion more broadly, whether on veterans' affairs or youth mental health, but there will be limits. Despite the talk we had earlier this morning on the importance of reconciliation, I don't think there'll be any kind of constitutional change to allow voice to Parliament. There will be interest in the religious discrimination bill. That will, I think, rile up most sides of the public with little obvious benefit achieved, but it will deliver to electorates with high proportions of conservative and religious immigrant communities, which I think is also important to the government. So in the face of all this, what is the government and the Prime Minister likely to do, and what should he do in 2020? I think the most important change required is to excite people's attention with a narrative that makes them listen again and be persuaded the government does offer some answers to the sort of free-floating anxiety, I think, that hangs over now, not just Australia, but so many developed countries, as well as addressing more practical issues like the cost of living, household bills. Energy policy and the connection with emissions reduction policy and climate change may still not be the priority for a lot of households in outer suburbia, but there's no doubt many people, more people, are more concerned about the impact of climate change after this summer, and they somehow want much more action from Canberra, even if they're not quite sure what that should be. We saw the start of the corresponding policy shift with the Prime Minister's first set speech of the year promising a future of technology advance and the release of a new technology roadmap, and working closely with business on innovation and energy policy rather than Labor's way, in his words, of imposing taxes. And the party, the Liberal Party at least, is behind him on this. Yet the scepticism about how this will work is, if anything, more pronounced in the business community than among his quiet Australians. And the government's international image problem is obviously extreme. So the government will be under a lot of pressure to do more, and I think it's certainly edging towards a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 later in the year, even though, like most other governments, it really has no idea of how to get there. Morrison will make a virtue of his steadiness, the government's responsiveness, and his ability to take practical action that protect Australians and Australian jobs in still a strong job market. He offers a strong defence of the national interest rather than fashionable global ideologies, but it's really about offering more of the same rather than anything too different. I don't think all of this will be enough to make 2020 other than a very difficult year politically and one of, at best, treading water economically. And all of that is without the need to expect the unexpected, the uncertainty, but probably the certainty of bad news rather than good. Black swans are no longer rare sightings. Thank you.